I'm Anna Grzma-Busa. I am the director of the Europe Center, and together with Catherine Stoner, who runs the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, it's our great pleasure to welcome you to another session of the Rethinking European Development and Security Seminar. Today, our speaker is Keith Darden, who is an associate professor in the Department of Politics, Governance, and Economics at American University. His research focuses on nationalism, state building, and post-communist politics. His first book, Economic Liberalism and Its Rivals, explained why post-Soviet states chose to join such very different trade organizations. And his new book, Resisting Occupation in Eurasia, explores the development of durable national identities and loyalties and how they play out during times of conflict and occupation. These national loyalties, of course, help to explain over a century of regional patterns in voting, secession, and armed resistance in Ukraine, Europe, and Eurasia. And given his expertise on the topic, there's really no better person than Keith to tell us about the Russia-Ukrainian war and the re-nationalization of Europe. Welcome, Keith.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to the Europe Center for CZDRL and Hoover for having me out. It's been quite a while since I've been back on campus. It's nice to be here, even though it's raining, which pretty much never happened in the 4 years that I lived here in California. So the talk today comes out of a revisiting of a lot of the political development literature, both on the European Union and on other macro political and macro institutional developments, like the rise of the state and the rise of the nation state, and also a policy interest in Europe. I'm at a policy school now. I'm in Washington, D.C. There's quite a bit of interest about how Europe is going to provide for its own security and the reasons why it hasn't been providing for its own security in recent years. And I'm particularly interested in the question of how the war has affected the development of European institutions, both the development of EU institutions, which I'll focus on for part of the talk, but also other European institutions like the nation state, which precede the European Union and have historically been significantly affected by war. War has played a significant role in the development of macro-political institutions. A narrower question that I'll look at is, has the increased external threat presented by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, led to an expanded military and fiscal capacity of the European Union? And this question comes out of some recent work by Dan Kelemen and Kate McNamara, who have conspired to make the EU interesting again to those of us who are interested in these kinds of macro political changes. And they argue that there's a peculiar development to the EU because it has not faced existential threat, that war has played less of a role in the development of Europe's institutions. And so the current situation, as tragic as it is, creates an opportunity for looking at an increase in the external threat associated with Europe and seeing the effect that that has on the development of European institutions. There's a broad literature in general about what shapes the development of macro-political institutions. The Bellicist version, that war shapes institutions, particularly war-shaped states, most classically articulated by Charles Tilly. There's also a historic functionalist liberal argument from my own PhD advisor, Ernie Haas. The idea that institutions form to enhance welfare, that there's a kind of transaction cost reduction associated with the creation of institutions, and you get evolution over time as institutions evolve to become more efficient, and you get the expansion of institutions through spillover. In other words, one issue area is linked to another, and so you expand as the interest in solving specific problems expands into other areas. Third version, or a third field, looks in a Weberian tradition from Max Weber, argues that institutions, macro-political institutions, in particular basic structures of power and authority, are underpinned by shared ideas. This has had less of a role in the state building literature, although Anna Grzymala-Busa has had some contributions in this area, and Phil Gorski and a variety of other theorists. I'm going to look in particular today, I'm going to evaluate Bellicist theories. And the argument is pretty straightforward, that war requires the increased mobilization of people and materiel, procurement, in order to survive. And the acute necessity of survival creates the conditions under which you can change institutions, which are otherwise extremely sticky and very difficult to alter. This leads, in particular, the increased cost of warfare leads to increased fiscal centralization and fiscal capacity. And there have been, this is a very active literature now, particularly in the last 5 years, there's some interesting revisions on this by Didac Poirot, our colleague at Yale, who argues essentially that this operates as long as you don't have substitutes. So in particular, ease of access to international finance, international lending, that makes it less necessary to extract resources and increase the fiscal capacity of the state to extract those resources from your own population. I'm going to revisit this later in the talk because I think this is a big part of why Europe doesn't develop along the lines that Bellicist theorists might predict. Again, Kelemen and McNamara make the case that Europe develops without this existential threat, and that its particular form is a result of the fact that it was a market-based integration, a more functionalist integration, rather than the need to provide security. We argue that the EU's unusually uneven and unstable institutional architecture is a product of the fact that Europe's political development has been pushed forward only gradually by processes of market integration without the pressure of war or immediate military threat. So we now have the opportunity to look at what happens to the development of the EU with the conditions of an acute external military threat. And I argue that we do not see the development of EU institutions. In other words, it's led to a very limited development and innovation in the development of European institutions at the EU level, and that states have substituted for the EU in organizing and financing the response to this external threat, and that it is still the case that war shapes institutions, but it privileges the existing states, not the European Union. To the Bellicist literature more broadly, I think a look at the European case can give us some insights about the role, in particular, of collective identity in conditioning the effect of war on the development of institutions. That war and the perception of threat, in particular, are based on how you draw the boundaries about the community that you're seeking to protect. And that in the contemporary case, those tend to be national boundaries and not European boundaries. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, just to be clear from the title, in talking about the re-nationalization of Europe, what I mean by nationalization is that decision-making authority, fiscal authority, resources, and to some extent popular identification or nationalism center on the nation state. So the removal of resources or the augmenting of resources being decided upon at the national level. Okay. So first thing we want to do is assess or measure the degree of external threat. So if we're saying that there's sort of been an up titration of external threat in Europe, we want to make the case that that has transpired in the last 3 years. And I should say that this is a fairly short time horizon for looking at institutional change. The war began about 3 years ago, close to 3 years ago. We might not expect significant changes in that time period. So partly what I'll argue here is speculative and potentially subject to future development. So let's first look at Russian revisionism, Russia as a source of external threat. There's been a fundamental shift in Russian official policy towards territorial revision along historic national lines. And this began first actually in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. Russia has made expansive and ambiguous territorial claims. So it's not clear whether the claims would be for the entire former Russian Empire, right? The Russian world, which would include Finland, Poland, the Baltic states, Moldova, right? And the ambiguity of that enhances the level of threat for Europe. right? Because they don't know where the line will be drawn. So it's potentially a threat to deeper and deeper areas of the continent. They've engaged in territorial expansion by force of arms in the most significant way of any country since 1945. We've had 3 years of high-intensity warfare. So the return of high-intensity warfare to Europe over a protracted period of time. Russia's military expenditure is about 6% of GDP, and it's over 1/3 of the budget devoted to the military. So Russia, like it has done since the 14th, 15th century, tends to concentrate its resources towards military capability. And it is still doing that in the present, which makes it punch above its weight and constitute more of a threat than you would otherwise anticipate based solely on its revenue. The Russian army, the Russian military is 1.5 million active duty personnel with 2.38 million total service personnel. It is currently the second largest army in the world. Beyond Ukraine, Russia has articulated that it wants to seek a new security architecture for Europe, in particular the withdrawal of forces from the areas that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact, a broad range of things that constitute threatening behavior from a European perspective. There's another side to the threat, however, which is also European inability to mobilize for their own security, and as a result of the decline in European defense capacity. So it's both Russian capability and intentions and Europe's inability to respond. Collective GDP of EU member states is 10 times Russia's GDP, but a tiny fraction of that is harnessed for security purposes. And it's spent on a very fragmented security architecture. There have been massive post-Cold War declines in personnel, in equipment, in ammunition, and overall in readiness. There's really only a handful of EU member states now that have military personnel more than 100,000. Several of them have full service military personnel less than 10,000. So approximately the forces that Russia loses in a week in Ukraine. So these are not the kind of militaries that you would expect to be able to respond to that Russian threat. There's been a precipitous decline, particularly in the core European power during the Cold War, which was Germany. Germany's military personnel declined from 495,000 in 1990 to 255,000 by the end of 1994, to 190,000 in 2006. And today, it's about 186,000. And most of those are actually non-combat personnel. So there's a sort of medical, logistics, and Germany in general has shifted away from the idea that their army should be devoted to war fighting, and it should be primarily oriented on crisis prevention. And so they completely reconfigured their military apparatus. Partly, this was all by design, that the Conventional Forces Europe Treaty, signed in 1990, was designed precisely to reduce the capability of mounting offensive operation on the continent of Europe. This led to significant declines in equipment, so that you were not supposed to be prepared for land warfare, and not just mothballing this equipment, but actually cutting it up with acetate and blowtorches and selling it as scrap. Right? Russia suspended its participation in the CFE in March 2015 and withdrew from it in November of 2023. Just to give you a sense of European military stocks, main battle tanks, 6,500 in Germany in 1992. Today, 339, or sort of on the eve of the war, 339. And of those, most of them were not really operational. And so one of the things that was discovered immediately when they were trying to ship some equipment to Ukraine is that their Leopard tanks actually couldn't drive. Right? And so Germany and France, the two leading EU member powers, the UK is obviously a significant military power. We've seen dramatic declines since the Cold War, and that really hasn't picked up. In terms of military personnel, you're not going to be able to read this, but that's partly the point. which is that Europe's military personnel is fragmented, shattered essentially, into 27 national militaries, none of which are effectively integrated with one another, and none of which can operate as units on their own. And so even though you have a fairly large number of military personnel in Europe, right? Even without the United States, in 2022, it was close to 2 million, right? So larger than the Russian forces. Their capabilities are very limited, right? Okay, so this provides an opportunity for Russia and is a source of genuine existential threat for Europe. And in particular gets activated with an unanticipated war in February of 2022. Okay, so let's look at the EU response to the war, the response to the treatment. The EU is prohibited by the Treaty of European Union, what used to be called the Maastricht Treaty, from using budgeted funds for expenditures with military or defense implications. The European Investment Bank also cannot invest in arms or ammunition production. And over the course of the last 3 years, there has been no effort to change the treaty, partially because this would require unanimity. And Hungary has been consistently a holdout on all aspects of funding military operations in Europe. But it wouldn't just be Hungary. And there just hasn't been pressure to make the kind of institutional change that would make fiscal centralization through the EU budget possible. Europe has provided some military and security assistance, or the EU has. The European Peace Facility, which was established before the war in March 2021 to facilitate the common foreign and defense policy operations, not entirely for Europe. Some of these funds end up going outside of Europe. A dedicated Ukraine assistance fund was created in March of 2024, and the EU has been training the Ukrainian military, so through UMAM Ukraine, since November 2022. I would point out, though, that the European Peace Facility is an off-budget fund. In other words, it gets around the treaty restrictions on using European budgets by taking contributions from the 27 member states, but those have to be re-upped by a unanimous vote on a regular basis. Europe has also supported the defense industry, created a European defense industrial strategy, all after the war and very much sparked by the war. The European Defense Industry Program, $1.5 billion. ASAP, which is primarily devoted to producing and acquiring 155 millimeter artillery shells and other artillery for the Ukrainian military, created in March 2024. DERPA, the European Defense Industry Reinforcement through Common Procurement Act, with the idea that you should be integrating the procurement processes across Europe so that also European arms industries can have expectations about contracts leading forward into the future, and you can begin to integrate the production lines of European militaries and create incentives for arms manufacturers to produce. The European Defense Fund, again, this precedes the war. So they're using instruments that were created in advance of the war, and these are not necessarily a response to the war. Close to 8 billion euros allocated in the 2021 to 2027 budget cycle. And this is also for cooperation in joint defense production and defense innovation. Okay, the funding has been quite limited for these initiatives. The European Peace Facility has devoted 6.1 billion or 6.2 billion to Ukraine as of the end of 2024. The Ukraine Assistance Fund is 5 billion, but that's going forward, right? And UMAM, the amount of the resources devoted to training Ukrainian armed forces has been only 261.7 million. The support for the European defense industry, similarly small, sort of 2 to 3.5 billion, depending on how different funding packages get counted and nested within these different programs. And overall, we're really only talking about 8 to 10 billion euros. Since 2022, devoted for security by the European Union. The EU's role has been very limited financially and organizationally. EU security support is a tiny fraction of its support in other key areas. For example, 800 billion euros for COVID crisis relief. EU institutions play no significant role in coordinating military spending among members. So part of what's going on with EDIRPA is they're sort of trying to get into that space, but the EU is not a significant player. Systems of procurement are still national. There's no common market in European armaments. French tend to buy from French producers. Everybody else tends to buy from the Americans. In general, you don't see much of a European role. The Commission is aspiring to play that role, but it hasn't done it. And the EU plays no significant role in coordinating the mutual security assistance of member governments, in other words, governments to each other, in particular because some countries in Europe are obviously more affected by the war, the frontline states, than other. And the EU has played no role in allocating resources for security within the European Union itself. It's also played no significant role in coordinating security assistance for Ukraine. So if we thought that this war was going to bring something out of the European Union, out of those institutions, falling forward through crisis, as the EU likes to discuss its development, we have not seen that. Why so limited? 3 reasons. First, and this gets back to Didac Quirot's discussions of war and state building, is the availability of substitutes. The EU and Euro-Atlantic multilateral security institutions weren't a great vehicle for expansion because they have unanimity rules or consensus rules, and large diverse membership, which meant that they got blocked very easily. Stepping into the breach has been the United States. The United States has been the primary response to the Russian threat, both in terms of military assistance to Ukraine and to EU members. Providing assistance to Poland, Slovakia, etc. And EU military assistance has been substantial. Ukraine assistance has also been US-led, and it's been, rather than multilateral or supranational institutions, like through the Commission, for example, it's been a coordinated bilateralism, which has bypassed the multilateral institutions. Even NATO is coming to take a role now with the Ukraine Defense Contract Group being passed on to NATO to some extent. But NATO was largely bypassed in the security assistance to Ukraine, right? So US contributions. In the US, it's called Operation Atlantic Resolve. The Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which has provided direct security assistance to Ukraine. Weapon stocks were supplied through Presidential Drawdown Authority. Foreign military funding or financing and other direct support to EU member states. Foreign military financing for Poland alone has been 11 billion euros, right? So more than the EU's entire security provision since February 2022, right? So it just gives you the sense of the scale of the US presence in European security. We provided intelligence support, especially targeting, and active military operations, and an increased US military presence in Europe. In other words, we've forward deployed our forces in Europe to protect against a potential Russian threat. Overall, US assistance has been security assistance alone has been $183 billion, right? Compare that to the 8 to 10 that has been provided by Europe. So when you have this large external player, it has taken over in its speed and efficiency in creating the sort of architecture of providing security for Europe. It's kind of replaced the prospect that the EU might have stepped into this role. So EU really hasn't felt, the whip of hunger, as it were, or the threat of death. The Ukraine Defense Contract Group is the primary mechanism for support for Ukraine. It's convened by the United States at Ramstein, September 2022. It's had 25 meetings monthly to coordinate the production, procurement, and delivery of weapons and munitions to Ukraine. It is the primary organized and coordinated response to the war. So if there's been some sort of organizational innovation as a result of the war, this is it. It's got several subgroups, capability coalitions for different defense needs, and all of it is underpinned by bilateral security agreements, such as the Vilnius Summit agreements. So individual EU members and non-EU members, the Ukraine Defense Contract Group has 52 state members within, that essentially organize bilateral provision of assistance to Ukraine, centrally coordinated through the Ukraine Defense Contract Group. Okay. Second reason that the EU response has been limited is that militarization, increasing sort of arms stockpiles, increasing funding to the military, leads necessarily to nationalization. And this is for several reasons. The state is still the primary entity providing security, right? There's no European army. And because of EU law, there are no European budgets associated with military funding in the formal budget. It shifts the dominant focus in Europe away from areas where the EU does have competence to an area where it has very little competence, that is security, and where those policies are least institutionalized. Fiscal authority in security affairs lies solely with national governments. And remilitarization involves national budgets, nation-state priorities and goals. There's very little coordination, actually, in the procurement of weapons among EU member states. The Poles do their own thing, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, et cetera, the French. And procurement, as a result, is not promoting deeper European integration. Just to give you a sense of scale of the increase in national military expenditure, there has been a very significant European response to the war. It just hasn't been an EU response, right? So this is military spending of the EU member states. Rose by 13.2% just in 2022, which was the largest increase in over 30 years. It brought EU military spending above 1989 levels. And I should say, spending and readiness are not the same thing. And so partly in Europe, spending is high because the cost of producing things is significantly higher than it was during the Cold War, because the product, there are fewer economies of scale. They're just making less of it. It's much more expensive to produce and much more expensive to buy. But you see a really significant increase over time. 2024, just this last year, it's anticipated, the data is not fully in yet, but it's anticipated to be 326 billion euros, right? So again, EU, 10 billion, the member states with their own priorities, with their own systems of procurement, 326 billion. By 2030, several European countries are likely to have independent offensive military capability, in particular Poland. And you can see here the annual percentage change in military funding. So war does make the state here, right? There's no question that war has increased the costs of survival and security in Europe. But the costs for that have been borne not by the European Union, but by the member states. Okay, Polish military expansion is a good example. This is the Polish Prime Minister in 2022. He says, the war in Ukraine means that we have to arm ourselves even faster. That is why we'll make an unprecedented effort this year. 4% of GDP for the Polish armed forces. Now it's up to 5%, which may be the largest percentage among all NATO countries. This will be clear evidence for all countries that we will defend our land, that Poland is safe, that Poland will be safer together with our allies. Again, defend our land, Poland will be safe. It's not really a focus on European security provision. It has led to national security priorities. Military expenditure increased from 8.5 billion in 2014 to 26.8 billion. And Poland, even though you could argue that European weapons are more appropriate for that theater, right? So that German Leopard tanks are better for the purposes that we would imagine the Polish military to be used for than Abrams tanks. They're buying exclusively from the United States. And the reason for this is because Poland does not fear only Russia, but also Germany. right? So the sort of two historic enemies of Poland, you don't want to be dependent on your arms from either of them, right? Active duty personnel more than doubled. Poland now has the, not counting Ukraine, Poland now has the largest army in Europe. Okay, third, and here is probably the most speculative. Despite the fact that I work on nationalism, it's very hard to look at these issues in a short time frame, and surveys aren't great at picking it up. But Europe, you know, the EU is a special thing, right? In fact, in many ways, it was a set of institutions that was deliberately designed to prevent warfare among its members, right? So if you go back to the coal and steel community, the inspiration behind creating the coal and steel community, these were the industries that were necessary for war making. And so that if you integrated them and put them under common supranational control, rather than the control of Germany or France, that those countries wouldn't have the independent capacity to wage war against one another, particularly not these long-term high attrition wars that rely heavily on industrial potential, right? And Europe, you know, it was a peace project in many ways, and it continues as an anti-national project. In other words, it is designed to prevent nationalization of trade, of production, right? First with the creation of the common market, but also the movement of people, the Schengen zone, the whole idea, you know, sort of the educational initiatives. The idea is that you would prevent war in Europe by integrating those populations. And this is kind of, if we think of an EU ethic in line with sort of the Weberian tradition of a Protestant ethic, this is really it, right? This was Jean Monnet, carried up through Jacques Delors. The core motivation behind European integration was to both increase prosperity, but first and foremost to enhance peace. The EU won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022, and the speech by the President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, that is quite indicative of this logic. It says, symbolic gestures alone cannot cement peace. This is where the European Union's secret weapon comes into play. An unrivaled way of binding our interests so tightly that war becomes materially impossible. Through constant negotiations on ever more topics between ever more countries, it's the golden rule of Jean Monnet. Better fight around a table than on a battlefield. It worked. Peace is now self-evident. War has become inconceivable. Yet inconceivable does not mean impossible. And that is why we are gathered here today. Europe must keep its promise of peace. I still believe this is our union's ultimate purpose, right? And so this is an institution, part of why that line goes into European law with the Treaty of Maastricht about not having military expenditures through EU funds is precisely because it is designed to prevent the member states from having the ability to make war against one another. But unfortunately, that has the side effect of limiting their capacity to make war against threats from the outside. The war also has privileged newer EU members and non-members. So newer EU members, the Eastern Bloc countries that joined the European Union, that are at odds in many ways with the European project. Also the US and the UK, but the post-enlargement members largely root their legitimacy in nationalism. And part of the motivation for getting out of the communist bloc was framed in nationalist terms. And I had a paper, article on this in World Politics about a decade ago, which looked at the extent of a national identity that was created prior to communism and the likelihood that communists would be thrown out of power in the first free elections. There's a very strong relationship. And those members that threw the communists out of power in their first three elections are now part of the EU. And their resistance to one supranational project, communism, right, on national grounds with national narratives, has carried over into this other supranational project, the European Union. For these governments, the EU was never about supranationalism, right? certainly not the overcoming of the nation state. The return to Europe was the return to Europe of the interwar period, right, when they were independent. And it isn't really tied to common European objectives. They treat EU rules, many of them, Poland in particular, and Hungary, as an a la carte menu that they can choose from according to national interests. They choose not to implement certain aspects of EU law that doesn't conform with their national agenda. Just to give you a couple of examples, in the court since 2022, there's been a wave of unilateral trade restrictions that was imposed. The EU has total control over the external tariff and trade. In late February of 2022, they waived tariffs and quotas on agricultural imports from Ukraine, created solidarity lanes for the export of Ukrainian agricultural products. Polish farmers blockaded border transit points. And in mid-April of that year, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia created unilateral import bans on Ukrainian grain and a whole host of other agricultural products. It's completely at odds with the EU, right? The EU eventually buckles and sort of agrees to some temporary restrictions. And then eventually Ukraine buckles and has export restrictions on its agricultural products as a way of preventing the optics of the EU shutting out their exports. Schengen violations. Several countries placed citizenship-based restrictions on access to the EU, which is against EU law, in particular preventing Russian citizens, including dissidents, from getting access to the Schengen zone, even when they had visas. Migration and refugee policy. New rules for managing a common asylum system have just been passed by the European Parliament and the Council. And just to reinforce the point that this isn't just one particular leader, Orban, or one particular party, Law and Justice. Donald Tusk, who is currently the president of the European Council, just a couple of days ago, February 4th, said Poland will not implement any migration pact or any provision of such projects that would lead to Poland's forced acceptance of migrants. This is definitive. To do so would waste the efforts of our Polish police officers, soldiers, and border guards who are risking their lives to limit the threat of illegal immigration and help make Poland one of the safest places in Europe. Again, a lack of commitment to European projects and a focus on national institutions. Also, the violation of minority rights, particularly of the Russian-speaking populations in Latvia and Estonia. But sort of a broad resistance to the notion of minority rights within Europe. And overall, the sort of rejection of supranationality in law. Poland in particular, in July of 2021, before the war, Poland's constitutional tribunal ruled that applying measures taken by the Court of Justice of the EU to the Polish judiciary was unconstitutional. Right? It's a direct challenge to the authority of the EU court, which has been the core institution that has led integration in Europe. So again, it's really these newer members, which the war highlights their nationalism. In other words, because of the existential threat posed by Russia, and has led them to reject aspects of European institutions that they do not see as being in their interest. We've seen a broad spread of nationalism with sort of a nationalization of European cultural spaces, not just on minority rights and languages. This is a monument in Odessa to Isaac Babel, which was removed under the decommunization laws, right? The memory laws, right? Isaac Babel, not exactly a Russian nationalist, but not necessarily part of a narrow conception of what it meant to be a Ukrainian, right? And so there have been thousands of treason prosecutions, some of which for things that we would not consider to be treason. This is a project that I'm working on currently. So we see this broad spread of sort of a reorientation towards a narrower conception of the nation and at odds with a supranational project. There doesn't seem to be in Europe a strong sense of collective identity and the sense that Europe is threatened, right? Some states have felt a strong existential threat, right, which they may see in European terms, right? So this is a question from Eurobarometer. It says the EU has taken a series of actions as a response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To what extent do you disagree with financing the purchase and supply of military equipment to Ukraine, right? You know, there's a broad, you know, sort of Sweden at the top, Cyprus at the bottom, but Bulgaria, Slovakia, you know, Greece, etc. Basically, the former Ottoman areas and the former Habsburg areas tend to be not to see Europe being threatened in this case. But the sense that we get here is that there isn't a cohesive sense of threat because there isn't a cohesive sense of European identity. They're charting national paths on their own. Okay, so to conclude, war makes the nation state, possibly, but not the European Union, right? Fiscal expansion and centralization only seems to take place when there's no substitute. Grants, borrowing, confiscation. So I actually think that the confiscation of Russian assets also isn't going to, it may enhance the ability to purchase equipment for Ukraine, but it's not going to enhance European security because it's not institutionalizing the capacity to extract these resources over time. If they can balance externally or free ride, we're not going to see these developments. And also, you need that shared identity. I think there has to be that common sense of threat and a common sense of peoplehood that activates that sense of threat. And finally, the war is privileging national actors in ways that I think may further endanger the post-World War II European project, that it's possible that this sort of fragmentation of Europe that we saw in 2022 could have consolidated into a more cohesive whole, and we have not seen that take place. Just to leave you with a quote from Robert Schuman, who as French foreign minister in 1951 was arguing for the creation of a European army in the European defense community at the conference on the organization of the European Army. Says the Atlantic system, if it meets and is sufficient for urgent as well as temporary requirements, leaves the problem of Europe unresolved. Or the Atlantic system leaves the problem of Europe unresolved, the Atlantic system being NATO. We believe that in any case, whatever intercontinental or global solutions are adopted elsewhere, there is a Europe to be organized, a Europe to be brought out of a fragmentation that has become anachronistic and absurd, a Europe that must go beyond the stage of outdated nationalisms. We have recognized this truth and we proclaim it in the economic and political spheres. It also applies to the organization of defense when a permanent military structure is sought. Atlantic defense and European defense are therefore not incompatible, do not duplicate each other, but are situated on a different level. The Atlantic organization is a system of coalition of national armies grouped under a single command. The European army must be a supranational army, replacing the national armies gradually but definitively. And I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is that that nationalism is not anachronistic at all. And that Europe has been re-nationalized by this war, in part because the United States has done so much to provide for the security of Europe. There's sort of a paradoxical effect here. But I'm very concerned that the future development of Europe is going to look a lot more like the interwar period than that post-war period that Schuman wanted to institutionalize. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. If you want to sit down, you may, but if you want to stand, you can do that too. So I'll handle questions, and since I'm handling the microphone, I thought I'd ask the first ones because I've done some work on this as well with Russia and Europe in particular, and so I think pointing out that power is relative is important. One thing I would like you to clarify is European contributions as a total that is outside of the European Union, when you add up member states, is very close to the U.S. I mean, it's not quite as high, but it's close. So
you include financial support as well as military.
Yes. Exactly. Yes. So it's not that I don't want to feed a narrative that they're not pulling their weight, because clearly they are, and as you pointed out, the ones closer are pulling a lot of weight. Still, the US is very important. Why not mention NATO, though, as an alternative institution? Because part of the reason they are, and of course, they do coordinate militaries in their work in NATO. So I'm curious why you don't mention NATO as an alternative institution. You focused on the US and its contributions, but of course, NATO is made up predominantly of European states. So, and then you gave great examples where there has not been cooperation or coordination within the European Union, but you didn't mention sanctions where there has been, right? That's a very clear area where they can coordinate. So could you, I think we've all been a little surprised, including perhaps Europeans themselves, that they've hung together for so long on sanctions that are so deep on Russia, as well as getting rid of a dependence on natural gas for the most part. So can you comment on that? Because that seems like something the EU can do, whereas military work, it can't do. It's designed for peace, not war.
Yeah. So on NATO, NATO hasn't played a significant role here. So I think that's one of the interesting, I don't know whether it's because Ukraine is not a NATO member, and there were concerns that, partly because of the narratives at the time that, it's NATO expansion that is creating the threat that leads Russia to invade, a false narrative, but a narrative that was out there. I don't know whether for that reason, but NATO hasn't played a role. I mean, the Ukraine Defense Contact Group has really been where the action is, and that includes NATO members and non-NATO members. And NATO's had a seat at that table, but it hasn't really played that coordinating role. And we've also had a lot of trouble within NATO with getting members to contribute. So NATO, in some ways, is the United States in Europe. And so the provision of security hasn't been provided for through NATO. If anything, NATO is an organization that facilitates the kind of free riding that has put us in this situation with respect to European countries. I don't want to imply that the EU has done nothing or that Europe has done nothing.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wanted to point out the difference in your terminology.
Yes, this is not the Europeans not stepping up. The Europeans have stepped up both in providing financial assistance and in undergoing a fair amount of hardship for cutting off their cheap energy supplies and in, sort of actually enforcing sanctions. So the Europeans have done quite a bit. But the logic of the Bellicist argument about this sort of macro institutional change really is about the sort of war and security provision being critical. And Europe has not done much in that sphere. As I pointed out, member states have done a lot. So I should be careful saying Europe and the EU, right? Yeah. Member states have done quite a bit. The Zeitenwende in Germany is real, right? They did put 100 billion euros towards defense procurement, and they're making steps right, in that direction. So I don't want to imply that Europe hasn't done anything, but that the way that Europe has responded has been, because it's a national response, actually facilitates the nationalization of Europe, right? So you could think about, there are several pathways that we could have seen Europe develop along as a result of the war. And one would have been the sort of Robert Schuman, European defense community direction, where you're really integrating the European armed forces, where you're releasing funds for defense procurement the way that they did for COVID and other crises. We haven't seen that. And, we've really seen a bolstering of national responses that are fairly loosely coordinated and coordinated by a non-EU member to the extent that they're coordinated at all.
Okay, I am keeping a list. So I already have on the list Christoph, Steve Stedman, Amikai Mogan, and Iveta Sergeyeva, and I will note your names. So Christoph first, Crombie. An actual European.
Yeah.
Accent in the whole thing.
Okay. I'll try to make two quick points. When you raise the question, okay, why has war not created a more united Europe or EU? My mind sort of went through the point that, in my opinion, and this is actually what one of your last slides showed, that a lot of Europeans don't really perceive a direct threat yet. So you sort of made a point, okay, there's been national reactions and nationality sentiments have been increased, not so much the EU identity, but Ukraine was not part of the EU yet, unfortunately. So I think, maybe I'm naive, I think that if the EU or one of the member states were attacked directly, that the response would have been different and that we would have had more of a Schuman-like response. And yes, unfortunately, that hasn't been there yet. Or maybe fortunately. Sort of related to that a little bit, when you were showing all these numbers about the small amounts that the EU has spent so far, I was thinking, well, you could make the same point about, in general, about healthcare policy or education policy or something like that. But I mean, the EU is spending very little money on those because of the same reason why they're spending very little money on defense, because the member states did not give the EU any or not much of any authority on those topics. So we cannot conclude from that the EU isn't doing anything. Its member states are doing it. And at least in these other areas, like healthcare and stuff like that, most people would probably say that they do better than the US. So in this point, they don't do so well. Probably, I would say, because they don't see that threat as much at this point. And it did take Schuman and so on a decade or so to come up with their initiatives after World War II. They're only 3 years along. I don't know what you think about it.
No, yeah, no, they're good points. And I actually have a slide in there about, maybe there's no threat. And there certainly is divergence within Europe in the perception of threat. And maybe that's because of the lack of a collective identity, which includes Ukraine, right? So, or a lack of a collective identity that includes the border states. So that, if you're in Slovenia, you don't think of Poland as part of the same entity, right? And that you don't feel threatened because Poland is threatened. But that kind of feeds the point that I was trying to make. But I agree, in many ways, the Bellicist literature deals when states are actually at war themselves, and Europe has not been at war. It has been under threat, right? There's certainly an argument that the threat has increased significantly, but they have not been at war. And so that might, if it's really the act of fighting for your national survival, Ukraine's really the only country in Europe that's facing that.
Okay, thanks. So we're getting a longer and longer list, but in the back, Steve Stedman is next with Amikai on deck.
Really interesting talk. And I think your argument is plausible, but I keep going to like the counterfactual and thinking that there's also a plausible argument that in the absence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of your dimensions of nationalism would keep going up. That is, what you discussed in terms of immigration, whatever migration, Schengen, all this stuff isn't a product of what happened 3 years ago, but a product of long-standing, more a decade-long series of pressures and domestic politics that get thrown into the warp and woof of nationalism. So humor me and talk about that, sort of the counterfactual.
Yeah, I think that partly I was a little careful in saying nationalization rather than nationalism, and that nationalism is one of the components that's leading to nationalization in Europe. But really the dominant one is that the shift in focus and resources of an issue area to where the state is still dominant, as opposed to European institutions. I do think that the war is increasing actual nationalism, though. And so that may have been a trend line in Europe more broadly. And I do think that that's the case with respect, part of the argument about Poland and the new member states is that they were basing their legitimacy on nationalism from the get-go. They based their departure from the Soviet system and Soviet bloc on nationalism. And those are very durable loyalties. This is sort of the core theme of my book, right? And so, yes, we would expect those to endure over time. The changes that have been taking place in Germany and France maybe are less, sort of the rise of the AfD and Le Pen, and so those might have been trend lines that we were on independent of this war. But the resources that have been going to the war have activated that, right? So that the idea that you shouldn't be using state resources, and we've seen it in this country too in the last election, shouldn't be using state resources for non-co-nationals. And so the war, because it's been a significant outlay of state resources for non-co-nationals, is active. Yes, is activating it, and migration too.
Okay, Amikai.
Thank you. Fascinating. Two quick questions. One, what does this re-nationalization mean for the possibility of divergence in member state alliances with other security providers? You've sort of alluded to the kind of ripple effect risks of this kind of devolution to the national level. Have you thought about what different member states are going to do in terms of hedging their bets, particularly just given the uncertainty about the United States as a security guarantor? I believe this was the last article that the late and much missed Ronald Inglehart published with Christian Welzel, 2015. They published a paper based on the World Values Survey, looking at the willingness of people to fight for their country. So going to that identity explanation, I'm not aware of a database that has asked the question whether people in Europe are willing to fight for the European Union or for European identity as opposed to national identity. I think that's interesting. If not, perhaps the World Values Survey or similar sources, it'll be very interesting to see whether there's been a shift in people's willingness or declared willingness to fight for their nation state as a way of sort of getting to that identity question. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, but that would be an excellent survey question, whether you're willing to fight for the European Union. And I think you would need that survey question to really get at this, rather than whether you're willing. I think usually with the World Values Survey, willingness to fight for nation, I don't think you're getting that much out of that question. In part because, and their Eurobarometer asks a whole bunch of questions about, are you willing to sacrifice high energy prices? Are you willing to, the sort of it's hard for people to understand the trade-offs, and sort of we don't get much from their survey response about what kind of costs they would actually be willing to pay, is my sense. But yeah.
What Inglehart shows is that since the early 1980s, there's been this kind of steady decline in Europeans reporting willingness to fight for their country, but there's been great divergence among the member states.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a lengthy list, and but we have till 1:15. I'm looking at Anna for confirmation. Yes, we do. So Iveta is next there on the aisle. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. So external threats shapes institutions, but I was wondering what shapes external perception of external threat. In particular, what can explain two very different approaches taken by Hungary and Poland, two countries that have similar position in EU. And Hungary doesn't, behave exactly as if Russia existential threat. So I was wondering, does Russia have anything to do with it? You hinted that maybe past experiences of threat may shape it. But yeah, I was wondering what are your thoughts on that? And can Russia exploit position of these countries in macro institutions, to its benefit?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I think that, if you look at the data on support for willingness to provide military support to Ukraine, the states that were previously part of the Russian Empire have very high levels of willingness to provide support. So perceptions of threat may also be related to imperial legacies and the imperial histories and sort of the extent to which they've defined their national identity against Russia in particular. And so Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, being particularly important in that regard. And as I sort of casually mentioned, the sort of the post-Ottomans and the Habsburgs, they're all in a similar kind. Slovakia, Hungary, Czechia, somewhat different, but for the most part, we're seeing those kind of imperial patterns. And Hungary, in its national narrative, is not particularly anti-Russian, right? In part because Russia was seen as an alternative to Vienna, right? And so there may be some sort of deep narrative legacies that carry up into perceptions of threat, but I don't think we have a good sense of what generates that sense of threat. I don't think it's coming from, media bots. I mean, I think this is, Russia's pretty active in Poland as well in the disinformation sphere. It doesn't seem to be having a significant impact on Polish attitudes, and so I don't think it's really coming from that side.
I think that's history. Yeah. Okay. Is it Miriam? Miriam? Yep. Marion. Yes, Marion. Yep. Hi. Thanks, Keith. So I had similar questions to some that have been asked about, that the Ukraine's not a member state and NATO and so forth. But so two small questions. One would be, if what you're sketching suggests an outer limit to the potential for a supranational organization to have a state-like identity. In other words, if as you have ranks of joiners at different times and more geographically spread, if it's just not going to be feasible to think about having that same cohesive sense of we are under threat as opposed to this corner of us is under threat. So that would be one part of it. But then also, as a non-Europeanist, wondering about the extensions of what you're describing, is whether we should understand the war versus financial aspects of state making, especially seen at this supranational, but perhaps also at the national level, as having fundamentally changed in perhaps a post-World War II or post-Cold War era, in which the nature of global security alliances, for instance, and the nature of security threats might really make impossible, except for a couple of states, thinking in nation state terms about security. In other words, not thinking in terms of wider alliances, but rather that as being something that's decoupled in its imperative force for state making or for institution making from the financial part of, it still seems somehow easier. Maybe this is because I'm not a Europeanist, to think about a national self-interest in terms of economics, finances and tariffs and so forth, as having a national impact, but as security is requiring or being necessarily transnational in terms of alliances, but also the threats themselves.
Yeah, so I would make a distinction between alliances and sort of supranational organizations yeah, and this kind of gets at the part of Amikai's question that I didn't answer, which is which is that yes, they are starting to think in terms of sub-alliances, and we see this percolating up in Europe. Including non-EU actors, particularly the British, but also the United States. And so I don't think that security is ever provided for entirely by external balancing. And I don't think that any political organization would survive making that assumption, right? And so the question is it going to be provided by a collective European organization, or to some extent by states and alliances? But to be in an alliance, you also have to be an effective provider of your own security, right? And part of what will be interesting, we've got another exogenous shock coming with the US relationship with Europe. It'll be interesting to see what happens when we stop providing that assistance, and when other actors sort of form clusters amongst themselves. Sort of Poland and the Nordic countries and the Baltic states are doing that now as well. There's sort of a block. I forget what it's called, but yes, so I do think that Tilly and sort of Bellicist literature, when they're looking at alternatives, they don't pay much attention to alliances, and we could probably think about external balancing as one of the things that alleviates the threat associated with war. But I don't think it alleviates it entirely. And I still think the state or the political organization requires that to survive. So,
great, thanks.
a long answer, but not complete.
Is it Danny? Yep.
Thanks. So kind of a basic question, but I'm curious what your thoughts are if will the result of the war in Ukraine change or how it will change the nationalization process in the rest of Europe, or will it have any effect?
How it will change the nationalization process?
Yeah, or like what effect will the result in
Oh, the
Ukraine-
outcome?
Yeah.
If you'd asked me this in February of 2022, I would have said Ukraine's going to be defeated and we're going to get a robust European security architecture. I think now we're likely to not get that robust European security architecture, in part because of the channels that have developed for providing support for Ukraine, and countries have had a sort of a 3-year window now in which to chart their own path, and the US has helped them chart that path independently, right? Because of the exigency of providing support, right? And US being in the only country in the position to provide that support, we've essentially reinforced that nationalization trend in a way that we could have gone in a different direction in 2022.
Interesting. All right. I apologize. I don't know your name. This gentleman at the front here.
Mirosław Wyrzykowski from Poland, the former judge of the Constitutional Court. Important. Why? You mentioned this decision of the Polish Constitutional Court of 2021, unconstitutionality of the foundation of the European Union. But the react was a letter of 20 retired judges of the Constitutional Court entitled 10 Lies. It means 1, 2, 3, up to 10 lies in the decision of the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court was hostile takeover of the system by Law and Justice Party. But just to be aware that it was decision completely without any meaning in practice. But the element is that you said reaction of the European Union as an institution was weak and slow. But a reaction of the Union is a reaction of the state members. And if we have in our mind a situation, relations, Germany, Russia, France, Russia, the fact that Mr. Putin was a guest during a wedding party of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria. If we consider Nord Stream 1 and 2, it means it took time to realize that the Siberian bear is alive, that it is not the end of history. Francis is among us. We didn't, we means Europeans, and I feel myself as European, we didn't believe that something so wrong may happen, or the governments of the European states, they do not believe what the Polish Prime Minister and we said always, be aware, be aware, be aware.
So before you respond to that, I'm going to turn to Eric Jensen up here for the last question, and then maybe you can take them both.
I was going to say something.
There's the microphone, Eric.
I was going to say something about the Polish Constitutional Court, but my Polish friend has made that unnecessary. So I'll ask another question. I was thinking during your presentation of, given where Europe is and the sense of Europe, where do you see EU flags waving apart from institutions that have to wave the EU flag? And where you see it is in earlier days in protests in Ukraine, in protests in Georgia, to a lesser extent, protests in Moldova. So it's kind of ironic, but perhaps states that are not yet admitted into the EU have the strongest sense of European identity.
Yes, or aspiration to be part of Europe.
And they're fighting for it.
Yes, but I'm not sure that when they're waving those flags, they're waving it for the principle of supranationality. that in many ways they're waving it. It's sort of the residue of the same motivations that led, sort of Polish nationalism to be the primary vehicle for, anti-communist sentiment. They're really, it's kind of a, we want to return to Europe, but not necessarily be subordinate to a supranational decision-making authority. So I'm less sanguine about the Europeanization of Europe's, outer frontiers than many, and it perhaps sounds like you. I'm more wary of it.
I'm in the business of trying to create hope.
Yeah, right. Because, Ukraine, it's hard to judge a country at war, but, the removal of monuments, sort of, and the language restrictions, things like that, they are very much counter to the spirit of the law in Europe. Don't suggest to me that there's a commitment to those values.
Maybe at the moment.
Maybe at the moment.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe at the moment.
Right. It's maybe more in favor of modernity as opposed to the European project.
Thank you for coming to my talk. It's always a pleasure to have someone from the Polish Constitutional Court, particularly those who acted in opposition to the hostile takeover of the court. Your valiant efforts did not go unnoticed. But I would say that what you've described is kind of the residue of the European strategy of that there was a belief that peace with the neighbors, in particular with Russia, would be achieved through interdependence, right? Through embedding, that if Russia is dependent on selling its natural resources to Europe, and Europe is dependent on those natural resources, that creates the kind of bond that you would pay a high cost if you ruptured that bond through warfare, right? Turns out Russia was willing to pay that cost, and turns out the Europeans were too, right? I don't think it's necessarily that they just didn't understand the nature of the Russian threat. I think it's more that this was consistent with a European strategy that had worked for Europe, and that reached its limits in its relation with respect to Russia and its neighbors,
and possibly China too.
Yeah.
I lied. There was one more question. Do you want to ask your question up here in the front? Yes. No, just one. We'll do just one because it's 11:13. I didn't see the other hand. Sorry.
Yes, this is okay. This is another European, Austrian, so EU member, non-NATO member, neutral country, special relations with Eastern Europe, I'd say, to say the least. And I thought it was curious what you said during your presentation and also now throughout the discussion. Whenever the term of European identity or collective European identity comes up, or the values, etc., etc., because I believe that probably when you're far away from Europe, it may look different, and also the fact that actually you very often use the term Europe almost interchangeably to European Union is also interesting. I don't really see something as a homogeneous European identity. I see elements that we can all agree on. I also see many elements that we don't agree on. And us, meaning Europeans and the EU member states. I see that from the beginning of the construction of the union, and even before that, as you mentioned, coal and steel, etc., there really has been an agreement to agree on the mere minimum necessary, and in order to grow ever closer together, as it is stated in the treaties, to work on that. And it's definitely still a work in progress. I would absolutely agree that the different European member states see the threat that from the war in Ukraine and Russia on completely different levels. And
sorry to interrupt. Can you just ask a question really fast at the end, if that's
well,
we're at the time.
The question would be: I don't really see the problem of re-nationalization actually knowing that in Brussels, ever since February 2022, there's been very, very, very few things that all EU member states have agreed so much on as to the response towards the war in Ukraine and Russia. So I'm much less pessimistic on that end. I am pessimistic on some other areas, but not in that field. And what has already been mentioned by the French gentleman there, the EU just doesn't have the mandate really to act decisively in this area of defense.
All right. Do you want to make a quick comment back on that?
Part of what we're interested in looking at the effect of war on these kind of macro political developments is whether the competences and the institutional capacities change as a result of war. So I agree that Europe was not designed for this. In fact, it was designed precisely to prevent this type, right? But there was some thought that the war might change that. And Europe isn't capable of defending itself, right? So the fragmentation, Europeans may feel comfortable with the fragmentation of their security architecture, but it means that they have a GDP that is equal to or close to the United States, not quite equal, and military personnel that would equal and surpass the United States, but very little in the way of the provision of their security. And Europeans may feel very comfortable with that, and they may not feel an external threat, and they may not see any sort of tension between the institutionalization of their national systems and developments in Brussels. But if the bellicist logic is correct, a heightened existential threat that may be posed by Russia is likely going to change that over time.
Great. Well, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Might be, what time is it now? Right. Only 3 years and 1:18. So I feel Anna's eyes upon me that I should wrap it up. Yeah, we all do. But Keith, thank you very much. That was great presentation and great set of answers. Thank you.